I've been carrying this secret for the last 82 years, and they made me sign papers before I even set foot off the island. Warned me that if I ever breathed a syllable about what we saw in that jungle, they'd take away all of those benefits that I'd earned, all the medals that I'd been given. But I'm now 102 years of age, and those signed papers really do not carry significant value to me when I realize that I'm the last person on Earth alive today with the truth about what happened to us on the island of Guadalcanal during the year 1942. If stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing. We share them daily, and they deserve to be heard. My name is Frank Coleman. I was 19 years old when I landed on Red Beach at Guadalcanal on August 7th, 1942. Private First Class, K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division. We were the Devil Dogs, though back then none of us felt particularly devilish. We were scared kids who'd barely finished boot camp. Most of us still couldn't believe they'd handed us real rifles and sent us into the Pacific to fight the Japanese Empire. The landing itself was almost anti-clockwise. We'd been told to expect heavy resistance, prepared for hell breaking loose the moment our landing craft hit the beach. But when we splashed ashore that morning, there was nothing. No gunfire, no explosions, just jungle. Dense, suffocating green that seemed to go on forever. And the smell. God, that smell. Rotting vegetation mixed with something else. Something sweeter and worse that I couldn't identify at the time, but would learn to recognize soon enough. The smell of death. We spent the first day securing the airfield the Japanese had been building. Henderson Field, they'd call it later, after a pilot killed at Midway. But on that first day, it was just a strip of cleared land with some equipment left behind. The Japanese had retreated into the jungle so fast they'd left rice, tools, even vehicles. We couldn't understand it then. Why would they run? They outnumbered us. They knew the terrain. Later, we'd learned they'd been ordered to regroup and counterattack. But in those first hours, moving through that abandoned construction site, we thought maybe this would be easy. Maybe the war in the Pacific would be won in a week. We were so goddamn stupid. The first night, they hit us. Not a full assault, just probing attacks, small groups coming out of the jungle, testing our defenses, seeing where we were weak. We lost 3 men from our platoon that first night. Private Johnson took a bullet through the throat while he was on watch. He drowned in his own blood before the medic could reach him. Corporal Stevens got bayoneted while taking a piss, and Private First Class Martinez just disappeared. 1 minute he was on perimeter guard, the next his post was empty, his rifle on the ground, and we never found his body. That was when I first heard the stories from the raiders. These were the 1st Marine Raider Battalion guys, some of the toughest, most experienced Marines in the Pacific. They'd hit the beach before us, been scouting inland. And some of them were talking about things they'd seen in the jungle, things that didn't make sense. Sergeant O'Malley was the one who told me. He was a veteran of China, had been fighting since before most of us could shave, and he looked scared. I'd never seen a sergeant look scared before. "You staying close to camp at night, Coleman?" he asked me on the second evening as I was filling sandbags. "Yes, Sergeant, we all are." "Good. You keep it that way. And if you hear anything strange in the jungle, you don't investigate. You radio it in, you stay put, and you wait for daylight." "The Japanese, Sergeant?" He looked at me for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw something I couldn't name. Maybe, maybe not. Just stay put. I didn't understand what he meant. Not then. On the 4th night, our platoon got sent on patrol. Lieutenant Morrison was leading us, a young officer from Virginia who was trying hard to live up to the responsibility of keeping 38 men alive. We were supposed to scout 3 miles north of Henderson Field, check for Japanese positions, radio back what we found, then return by dawn. We moved through the jungle in a long file, each man staying close enough to see the one in front of him, but far enough apart that a single grenade couldn't take out more than two of us. The jungle at night was a different world. You couldn't see more than a few feet, even with a full moon, and every sound seemed amplified. Insects buzzing, leaves rustling, water dripping, and underneath it all, the constant awareness that there were men out there who wanted to kill you, who were trained to move silently through this terrain, who could be 10 feet away, and you'd never know until the blade went in. We'd gone maybe 2 miles when Corporal Hayes, who was on point, raised his fist. We all froze. In the darkness, I could barely make him out, just a shadow among shadows. He signaled for Lieutenant Morrison to come forward. I was fourth in line, close enough that when they started whispering, I could hear snatches of it. "Tracks, sir. Big ones." "Japanese patrol?" "I don't think so, sir. These are different." Lieutenant Morrison moved up to look, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he called for Sergeant Rodriguez. "Tony, get up here. Tell me what you make of this." Sergeant Rodriguez had been a hunter in New Mexico before the war. If anyone could read tracks, it was him. He knelt down, and even in the moonlight filtering through the canopy, I could see him stiffen. "Sir, these aren't Japanese." "What do you mean they're not Japanese?" "I mean, these tracks are too big. Way too big. The Japanese are small, sir. Most of them wear like size 7, 8 boots. These have to be size 15, maybe bigger. And the stride length is wrong. These are spaced like someone 7, 8 feet tall was walking." "That's impossible." "Yes, sir. But that's what the tracks say." Lieutenant Morrison was quiet. Then he said, "Could it be one of ours? A tall Marine who got separated?" "In bare feet, sir? These are barefoot prints, and there's more than one set. I count at least 3 different individuals, all big." I felt the fear then. Real fear, not the manageable anxiety of facing a known enemy, but something deeper. Something that reached into a more primitive part of my brain and started screaming warnings. "We follow them," Lieutenant Morrison decided. "Carefully. It might be Japanese in some kind of disguise, trying to fake us out. Or it might be natives. Either way, we need to know what we're dealing with." We followed those tracks for another half-mile. The jungle got denser, the canopy thicker overhead until almost no moonlight penetrated. We were moving mostly by touch, each man keeping one hand on the pack of the Marine in front of him. The tracks kept going, steady and unhurried, like whatever made them wasn't worried about being followed. That's when we heard it. A sound, low and deep, echoing through the jungle. Not Japanese, not anything I'd heard before. It was like a horn, but organic, like someone blowing across the mouth of a massive bottle, but with a quality to it that made my chest vibrate. We froze. Every one of us. Lieutenant Morrison raised his hand, and we went silent, trying to determine where the sound had come from. It echoed again, and this time it was answered. Another sound from a different direction. Then a third from somewhere behind us. "They've got us surrounded," someone whispered. "Quiet," Lieutenant Morrison hissed. The jungle went silent, not normal silent, but wrong silent. No insects, no birds, no rustle of small animals, just our breathing and the sound of our heartbeats. Then they stepped out of the trees. I don't know how to describe them in a way that will make you believe me. I know how it sounds. I know what you're thinking. But I was there, and I saw them, and so did 37 other Marines, and every single one of us would have sworn on anything holy that what we saw was real. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the rotting vegetation smell we'd gotten used to. This was different. Musky, animal, but with something else underneath it. Something ancient, like the smell of stones that have been underground for 1,000 years. It hit me before I even saw them clearly, and my body reacted before my mind could catch up. Every hair on my arm stood up, my stomach clenched, my mouth went dry. They were tall, not 7 feet, not 8 feet, closer to 10 or 12 feet, maybe bigger. In the darkness, it was hard to judge. But they towered over us, these massive shapes moving through the jungle with an unnatural silence for their size. They were humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture. But wrong. Everything about them was wrong. The way they moved wasn't right. Despite their size, there was no crashing through the undergrowth, no snapping of branches. They glided between the trees like they were made of smoke. Their massive bodies somehow navigating the dense jungle without making a sound. It defied everything I knew about physics, about mass and momentum. Something that big shouldn't be able to move that quietly. I could hear my own breathing, loud and ragged in my ears. Could hear Private Williams beside me, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Could hear the safety clicking off on someone's rifle, the metallic sound impossibly loud in the stillness. But from them? Nothing. Just that impossible, terrifying silence. Their proportions weren't right. The arms were too long, reaching past where the knees should be. When one of them shifted its weight, I could see those arms hanging, the hands nearly touching the ground. The legs were thick, tree trunk thick, but they bent at angles that looked painful. The knees seemed to hyperextend, bending slightly backward in a way that made my own knees ache just looking at them. The heads were too large, bulbous in a way that suggested intelligence, but also something alien. Not alien like a movie, but alien in the way that an ape's face is almost human, but fundamentally other. There was something in the shape of the skull, in the forward thrust of the face, that spoke of a different evolutionary path, a road not taken, or maybe a road we didn't know existed. And their skin, what I could see of it in the moonlight filtering through the trees, was dark. Not dark like a Melanesian islander. Dark like charcoal, like stone, like volcanic rock cooled and weathered by centuries. The texture looked rough, almost bark-like in places. I could see what might have been old scars, lighter patches that caught the moonlight differently. Or maybe they were natural markings. I couldn't tell. But what struck me most, what still haunts me when I close my eyes, was how they looked at us. There was intelligence there. Not human intelligence, but intelligence nonetheless. The way a wolf might study you before deciding whether you're prey or competitor. Calculating, assessing, understanding on some level that we were as confused and frightened as they might have been curious. One of them stepped forward into a patch of moonlight, and I got my first clear look. Its face was almost human. Almost. The eyes were too large, set too wide apart, with a slight downward slant that gave them a sorrowful appearance. But the eyes themselves, God, the eyes. They were dark, so dark they looked black in the moonlight. But when the light caught them just right, I could see depth there, layers, like looking into deep water. The nose was flat, just slits for nostrils, positioned differently than a human's, higher up on the face, almost between the eyes. The mouth was a wide gash that, when it opened slightly, revealed teeth that looked wrong. Too many of them, or too sharp, or both. Not fangs exactly. More like the teeth of something that ate a lot of tough vegetation but could defend itself if needed. There was hair, but not like human hair. More like thick bristles, dark and coarse, covering the head and shoulders, growing sparser down the arms and chest. In the moonlight, I could see it move slightly with each breath. Could see the chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was almost but not quite like human breathing. Slower, deeper, more deliberate. It raised one massive hand, palm forward, in what might have been a gesture of peace or warning. I couldn't tell. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Every rifle in our platoon was pointed at these things, but nobody fired. I think we were all too shocked, too disbelieving of what we were seeing. Lieutenant Morrison, to his credit, didn't order fire. He just stood there, arm half raised, staring. The giant in front made a sound. Not the horn-like call we'd heard before, but something more like speech, deep, resonant, with clicking and humming sounds mixed in. It wasn't any language I'd ever heard. It sounded ancient, older than the jungle itself. Then, slowly, deliberately, they backed away. One step, then another, melting back into the jungle as silently as they'd appeared. Within seconds, they were gone. The only evidence they'd been there at all were those massive tracks in the mud and the slowly returning sounds of the jungle coming back to life. Nobody said anything for a full minute. Then Private Williams, a kid from Ohio who'd been drafted, started laughing. High-pitched, hysterical laughter that cut through the darkness. Did we just see? He couldn't even finish the sentence. Quiet, Lieutenant Morrison snapped, but his voice was shaking. Everyone back to camp, now, double time, stay alert. We ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 38 United States Marines ran through that jungle like our asses were on fire. Discipline be damned. We half expected those things to come crashing through the trees after us, but they didn't. The jungle stayed quiet, stayed empty, and we made it back to the perimeter just as the sun was starting to rise. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my rifle. Private Williams was still laughing, that hysterical edge to it that made everyone nervous. Corporal Hayes just kept repeating, "Did you see them? Did you see them?" over and over. Sergeant Rodriguez was the calmest of all of us, but his eyes had that 1,000-yard stare I'd later learned to recognize in combat veterans who'd seen something they couldn't process. We stumbled into camp just as Reveille was sounding. The Marines on perimeter duty took one look at us and knew something was wrong. We must have looked like we'd seen a ghost. Hell, maybe we had. I still don't know what to call those things. What happened out there? One of the guards asked as we passed through the wire. Nothing, Lieutenant Morrison said quickly. Too quickly. Routine patrol, no contact. But the look on his face said everything his words didn't. Lieutenant Morrison went straight to Captain Anderson. I was close enough to hear some of it, so I lingered near the command post, pretending to check my gear. Sir, we need to report this. Report what, Lieutenant? We saw... Sir, I don't know what we saw, but it wasn't Japanese, and it wasn't human. Captain Anderson looked at him for a long moment. How many men with you? 37, sir. And all of them saw this? Yes, sir. Where did you encounter them? About 3 miles north, in the dense jungle near the river. Captain Anderson was quiet. Then he said, Lieutenant, you're exhausted. You've been in combat for 4 days straight. The jungle plays tricks on people, especially at night. I'm sure whatever you saw has a rational explanation. Sir, with all due respect, 38 trained Marines don't hallucinate the same thing at the same time. That's enough, Lieutenant. You're dismissed. Get some rest. We'll discuss this later. But we never did. At least, not officially. That night, something strange happened. A delegation arrived at our position just after dark. 3 men in civilian clothes, but everything about them screamed military intelligence. Crisp haircuts, polished shoes that had no business being on Guadalcanal, the kind of posture that came from years of officer training. They arrived in a jeep that had no unit markings, no identification of any kind. I was on guard duty when they rolled up to the command post. One of them, a tall man with steel gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen things, glanced at me as he passed. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but in that moment I felt like he was reading my soul, cataloging everything I'd ever seen, ever done, ever thought. They went straight to Captain Anderson's tent and were in there for hours. We could see the lamp burning inside, shadows moving against the canvas. At one point, voices were raised. Not quite shouting, but close. Captain Anderson's voice saying something like, "My men aren't liars," and another voice, colder, responding with something I couldn't make out. Around midnight, they called for Lieutenant Morrison. He looked at us before he went in, and I'll never forget that expression. It was like a man walking to his own execution, like he knew his life was about to change in ways he couldn't control. He was in that tent for 3 hours. 3 hours. The rest of us tried to sleep, but nobody could. We just lay in our foxholes, staring at that lit tent, wondering what the hell was being said in there. When Lieutenant Morrison finally emerged, the eastern sky was just starting to lighten. He looked pale, shaken, 10 years older than when he'd gone in. The intelligence officers left immediately after, their jeep disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness without a word to anyone. Morrison stood outside the command post for a long time, just staring at nothing. Then he lit a cigarette with shaking hands, smoked it down to the filter, and crushed it under his boot. Only then did he gather our platoon together. We assembled in a clearing near the tree line, 38 Marines standing in a loose circle, every one of us exhausted and confused and scared in ways we couldn't articulate. "What we saw last night," he said quietly, "was classified. I'm not allowed to discuss the specifics, but I can tell you this. We are not the first patrol to encounter unusual elements on this island. There are things in this jungle that Command is aware of but doesn't fully understand. Our job is to fight the Japanese, not to investigate local wildlife or indigenous phenomena. Is that clear?" "What were they, sir?" Corporal Hayes asked. "That's classified, Corporal. And if anyone asks, if anyone outside this platoon asks, we saw nothing. We had a routine patrol, no contact with the enemy, and we returned without incident. Those are the facts of the mission. Nothing else happened. Nothing else will be discussed. And if any of you decide to talk about what you think you saw, you'll find yourselves court-martialed so fast your head will spin. Am I clear?" We all nodded. What else could we do? But the strange thing was, over the next weeks, as we fought to hold Guadalcanal against the Japanese counterattacks, I kept hearing stories. Whispered conversations between veterans, rumors from other companies. Always the same basic story with different details. A Marine patrol encountering massive figures in the jungle. A listening post hearing impossible sounds in the night. Tracks found that were too big to be human. And always the same response from Command. Classified. Don't discuss. Never happened. The battles got worse. The Japanese threw everything at us trying to retake Henderson Field. We fought at the Tanaru River in August, where we killed nearly 1,000 Japanese soldiers in a single night. I was there when the sun came up and revealed what we'd done. The river ran red, literally red with blood. Bodies stacked 3 and 4 deep at the sandbar where they'd tried to cross. Some of them were still moving, still alive despite wounds that should have killed them instantly. That's where I learned what combat really meant. Not the clean, heroic version they show in the movies. The real thing. The smell of cordite and blood and shit and fear. The sound of men screaming for their mothers in a dozen different languages. The weight of knowing that you'd killed another human being and that you'd do it again in a heartbeat if it meant staying alive. We'd been dug in along the West Bank, waiting. Command knew they were coming. Our scouts had spotted their approach. Close to 1,000 men, Colonel Ichiki's regiment, coming straight at us like they thought we'd break and run. They didn't know we'd set up interlocking fields of fire, machine gun positions that covered every approach. They didn't know we were ready. They hit us just after midnight. Banzai charge, screaming, "Nippon! Nippon!" at the tops of their lungs, bayonets fixed, coming straight at our lines like they thought willpower alone would carry them through our defenses. Maybe it had worked before, against Chinese troops or Filipino garrison forces. It didn't work against Marines who'd had 4 weeks to prepare positions and were defending the only airfield for 1,000 miles. I was on the firing line behind a .30 caliber machine gun when they came out of the jungle. Just shadows at first, moving fast, the moonlight catching on bayonets and helmets. Then they were in the kill zone, and Lieutenant Morrison gave the order. Fire! The world exploded. Our machine guns opened up all at once, tracers cutting through the darkness like streams of fire. The noise was incredible. The hammering of the guns, the crack of rifles, the whistle and boom of mortars dropping into the Japanese assault force, and underneath it all, the screaming. God, the screaming. They kept coming. Even as their men fell in rows, even as the river began to pile up with bodies, they kept coming. I'd change out ammunition belts and they'd be closer. I'd fire another burst and they'd be closer still. Some of them made it to our wire, got tangled in the barbed wire we'd strung. We shot them there, point blank, and they died hanging in the wire like scarecrows. It went on for hours, wave after wave. My gun barrel got so hot we had to pour water on it to keep it from warping. My ears were ringing so badly I couldn't hear orders, just followed hand signals. My hands were blistered from handling hot ammunition. But we held. At some point during the night, during a lull in the fighting, I looked up and saw something at the tree line. A shape, massive and dark, watching from the shadows. One of them, the giants, just standing there, motionless, as hundreds of men killed each other not 50 yards away. I tried to point it out to Corporal Hayes, but by the time he looked, it was gone. Later, I wondered if I'd imagined it. Combat does that to you, makes you see things that might not be there. But I don't think I imagined it. I think it was real. I think they were watching us, these ancient beings, watching as we demonstrated what humans do best, kill each other in increasingly efficient ways. When dawn finally came, the killing stopped not because the Japanese retreated, but because there was nobody left to retreat. We'd slaughtered them. There's no other word for it. The river was choked with bodies. The sandbar was gone, replaced by a carpet of corpses. The jungle on the far side was shredded by machine gun fire, trees cut in half, vegetation torn to pieces. We found Colonel Ichiki's body later that morning. He'd killed himself rather than face the disgrace of defeat. His sword was beside him, his blood soaking into the sand. I felt nothing looking at him, not pity, not satisfaction. Just a hollow numbness that I later learned was combat fatigue. The smell came later as the sun climbed higher. In that tropical heat, bodies start decomposing fast. The smell of death mixed with the lingering gunpowder and the sweet rot smell of the jungle created something I still can't describe. Something that gets into your clothes, your hair, your lungs. Something you can't wash away. But even there, even in the middle of that carnage, I heard the rumors. Marines whispering about things they'd seen in the jungle during the night attacks, shapes that were too tall, sounds that weren't Japanese, tracks found in the morning that didn't make sense. Nobody talked about it officially, but we all knew. Some of us had seen them. The rest had heard enough to believe. September brought Edson's Ridge, what they'd later call Bloody Ridge. The Japanese threw wave after wave at us, trying to break through to Henderson Field. We held. Barely. I spent 2 days and nights in a foxhole with Corporal Peters, a kid from Montana who'd lied about his age to enlist. He was 17 years old, and he killed more Japanese soldiers than either of us could count. On the second night, during a lull in the fighting, he grabbed my arm. "Coleman, you see that?" "See what?" "Out there, past the Japanese positions, something big moving through the trees." I looked where he was pointing. At first, I saw nothing. Then, in the moonlight filtering through the smoke and haze, I saw it, a massive shape, maybe 100 yards beyond where the Japanese were dug in, moving slowly, deliberately, watching. "That's not Japanese," Peters whispered. "No," I agreed. "It's not." We watched it for maybe 5 minutes. It never came closer, never made a sound, just stood there, observing the battle like it was studying us. Then it melted back into the jungle, and I never saw it again. Not that night. Peters died 3 hours later when a mortar round landed directly in our foxhole. I survived because I'd gone to get more ammunition. When I came back, there was nothing left of him but dog tags and pieces I tried not to look at too closely. I don't know if he told anyone else what he'd seen. I hope not. I hope his last days weren't made worse by people thinking he was crazy. But what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about what we were facing on that island. October, 3 months into the campaign. We were pulling back from a forward position after a Japanese attack, moving through the jungle at night because moving during the day would have gotten us killed by their artillery. Our platoon was down to 26 men. We'd lost 12 to combat, disease, and accidents. Every one of us was sick with something: malaria, dysentery, jungle rot. We'd lost so much weight that our uniforms hung off us like scarecrows. I was helping carry Corporal Stevens, who'd taken shrapnel in his leg from a knee mortar. He was delirious with pain and fever, mumbling things that didn't make sense. Private Jackson had his other arm, and we were stumbling through that dark jungle, trying to make it back to the aid station before Stevens bled out. The jungle at night had become almost routine by then. The sounds, the shadows, the constant awareness of danger. We'd learned to move through it like ghosts ourselves, making barely any noise despite carrying a wounded man. But this night was different. The jungle was too quiet. Even the insects had gone silent. "Something's wrong," Jackson whispered. I felt it too. That primitive part of my brain screaming warnings again. The same feeling I'd had the first time, back on that patrol when we'd found the tracks. We passed through a clearing, maybe 20 yards across. The moon was full that night, bright enough to cast shadows, bright enough to see clearly. And there, at the edge of the trees, backlit by that cold white light, was one of them. I stopped dead. So did Jackson. Stevens, half conscious, didn't even notice. It was smaller than the ones we'd encountered before. 8 or 9 feet tall, maybe. Its proportions were still wrong. Arms too long, head too large. But something about its posture was different. Younger, I thought, though I had no rational reason to think that. It wasn't moving, wasn't threatening us. Just standing there, watching. Those large eyes, reflecting the moonlight, fixed on our small group of exhausted, battered Marines, stumbling through the night with our wounded. Jackson's hand went to his rifle. I grabbed his wrist. "Don't!" But it's not attacking. Don't shoot. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. Me and Jackson, staring at this impossible thing. Stevens unconscious between us, the jungle utterly silent, like the whole island was holding its breath. Then it did something I'll never forget. It raised one massive hand, not in threat, not in warning, but in what looked like acknowledgement. Recognition? I don't know the right word, but it was a gesture, a communication. One intelligent being acknowledging another. And in its eyes, in those alien, impossible eyes, I saw something that shattered every assumption I'd had about what we were dealing with. I saw pity, understanding, sorrow, like it was bearing witness to what we were doing to each other, what we were doing to ourselves. And it grieved for us. For a moment, just a moment, I forgot I was a United States Marine in the middle of a war. I forgot about the Japanese, about Henderson Field, about everything except the profound strangeness of that exchange. Here I was, a 19-year-old kid from Ohio, standing in a jungle on an island most Americans couldn't find on a map, locking eyes with something that shouldn't exist, and feeling a connection I couldn't explain. Then Stevens groaned, breaking the moment, and when I looked back, the giant was gone, faded back into the jungle as silently as it had appeared. "Did you—" Jackson started. "Yeah," I said. "Help me with Stevens. We need to move." We didn't talk about it again. Not then. Not ever. What was there to say? We'd both seen it. We both knew what it meant. That these things, whatever they were, weren't just animals. They were intelligent, aware. And they were watching us destroy ourselves over a piece of their home. When we finally got Stevens to the aid station, the medics asked why we were so shaken up. "Combat stress," Jackson told them. And maybe it was. But it was a different kind of stress than what they meant. Stevens survived, by the way. Lost his leg, but he survived. Got shipped back to the States in November. Last I heard, he made it to his 80s. Never spoke about Guadalcanal much, according to his daughter, who reached out to me years later. But he kept a sketch he'd drawn of something tall standing in a jungle clearing. His daughter didn't know what it meant. I did. The battle for Guadalcanal continued through November and into December. More attacks, more deaths, more nights in foxholes wondering if we'd see morning. But through it all, there was this undercurrent, this awareness among those of us who'd seen them. We started recognizing each other, Marines from different companies, different battalions, who had that same faraway look, that same hesitation when someone mentioned the deep jungle. We never talked about it openly. The standing orders were clear. But we knew. A nod here, a meaningful glance there, a moment of shared understanding that needed no words. I saw a raider one day in November, sitting by himself near the airfield, staring into the tree line with that expression. I sat down next to him without asking. Didn't say anything, just sat there. After 5 minutes, he spoke. "How tall was yours?" 10, maybe 12 feet. "You?" "About the same. Saw 3 of them." "You?" "5 the first time, 1 the second." He nodded slowly. "They're watching us, studying us, like we're some kind of experiment." "Maybe we are," I said. "You scared?" I thought about that. Not of them. They haven't hurt anyone. If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead. I'm more scared of what it means. What does it mean? That the world's a lot stranger than they told us in school. That there are things out there that don't fit in any textbook. That maybe humans aren't as special as we like to think. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I hope they survive this. The war, I mean. I hope when we leave, they're still here." "Yeah," I agreed. "Me too." The Japanese finally evacuated in February of 1943. They pulled out under cover of darkness, and we'd won. At a terrible cost. 7,000 American casualties, more than 20,000 Japanese. And the island itself, that beautiful, terrible island, scarred by battle in ways that would take decades to heal. But we'd won. Henderson Field was ours. The campaign that was supposed to last a few weeks had taken 6 months. But we'd done it. The Devil Dogs and the rest of the 1st Marine Division had held the line. Before we shipped out, those same men in civilian clothes came back. Only this time there were more of them. A dozen at least. And this time, they weren't subtle about what they were doing. They set up in a large tent near the command post and called us in one by one. Not just our platoon. Marines from across the division. Anyone who'd reported seeing something unusual, anyone who'd filed a report that mentioned large humanoid figures, unexplained tracks, or encounters with beings that weren't Japanese and weren't native islanders. There were more of us than I'd realized. Nearly 60 Marines standing outside that tent in the February rain, waiting our turn to be questioned, threatened, or whatever the hell they were planning to do to us. I recognized some faces. The raider I'd sat with in November, Corporal Hayes from our first encounter, Marines from other companies I'd never met, but who had that same look in their eyes. When my turn came, they sat me down at a field table across from 3 men. The tall gray-haired one from before was in the center. The other 2 were younger, sharper, with eyes that missed nothing. "Private First Class Coleman," the gray-haired man said, not looking up from a file folder. My file, I realized. "You were part of Lieutenant Morrison's patrol on August 11th. "Yes, sir." "And you claim to have seen something unusual during that patrol." The way he said "claim" made it clear what he thought about my report. But I'd been in combat for 6 months by then. I'd faced down Japanese bonsai charges. I wasn't about to be intimidated by some intelligence officer. "I didn't claim anything, sir. I reported what I saw, what we all saw, sir." He looked up at me then, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Or just recognition that I wasn't going to roll over. "What you saw," he said carefully, "was the result of combat stress, extreme environmental conditions, possible malaria fever, and the natural tendency of the human mind to interpret ambiguous sensory data in ways that make sense to it. You were exhausted. You were scared. You'd been in combat for days. Is it not possible, Private, that your mind simply filled in the gaps?" "No, sir. No." "With respect, sir, I know what I saw. So did the other 37 men with me. So did the other 50-some Marines out there waiting their turn. We didn't all have the same hallucination at the same time." One of the younger officers leaned forward. "Did you discuss what you saw with the other men? After the encounter, I mean. Did you talk about it, share your impressions?" I saw where he was going. "No, sir. Lieutenant Morrison ordered us not to discuss it. We followed those orders." "But surely you must have—" "We followed our orders, sir." The gray-haired man held up a hand, silencing his colleague. He studied me for a long moment, then pulled out a photograph from the file. He turned it so I could see it. It was blurry, taken from distance, but clear enough. A massive humanoid figure, at least 10 feet tall, standing at the edge of a jungle clearing. The scale was obvious because there was a jeep in the foreground for comparison. "Do you recognize this?" he asked quietly. My blood went cold. They had proof, actual photographic proof, and they were showing it to me, which meant, "Is that a threat, sir?" "No, Private, it's a statement of fact. We know what you saw. We know it was real. We've documented it, photographed it, even captured video footage, though the quality is poor. We've sent anthropologists to study the footprints, biologists to analyze the limited physical evidence we've collected. We have reports going back to 1905 from German colonists who claim to have encountered these beings in the interior of the island. This is not new. This is not unknown. But it is classified." He leaned back in his chair. "Do you understand what I'm telling you, Private Coleman? I'm telling you that you're not crazy, that what you experienced was real, but I'm also telling you that this information can never leave this tent. For reasons of national security, for reasons of international stability, for reasons you're not cleared to understand and frankly don't need to know, the official position of the United States government is that nothing unusual happened on Guadalcanal. You fought the Japanese. You won." That's the only story. "Why?" I had to ask. "If you have proof, if you know they're real, why hide it?" The gray-haired man exchanged glances with his colleagues. Then he sighed. "Because, Private, the world is barely holding together as it is. We're fighting a global war on multiple continents. Millions are dying, nations are being destroyed, empires are collapsing. And in the middle of all that chaos, you want us to announce that there are undiscovered hominid species living in the Pacific? Species that are possibly more intelligent than modern humans? Species that have somehow avoided detection for thousands of years? Do you have any idea what that would do to our understanding of human evolution? To our religious institutions? To our sense of our own place in the natural order?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "The truth is, Private, humanity isn't ready for this. Maybe it never will be. But right now, in the middle of the worst war in human history, adding this to the mix would be catastrophic. So we're burying it. We're classifying it at the highest level. And we're asking, no, we're ordering you and every other man who saw these beings to never speak of it. Not to your families, not to other veterans, not to anyone. Ever." He pulled out a document. "This is a non-disclosure agreement. It's legally binding. If you violate it, you'll face court-martial, imprisonment, and the loss of all your benefits, your pension, your health care, everything, and we will enforce it. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have any questions?" I had 1,000 questions, but I only asked one. "What are they?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "We don't know. Not really. The anthropologists have theories. Gigantopithecus blacki, possibly, though that species supposedly went extinct hundreds of thousands of years ago. Or something else entirely. Something we don't have a name for yet. But whatever they are, they've been here a long time, longer than we have. And if they've survived this long while remaining hidden, maybe we should let them continue to do so." He pushed the document across the table. "Sign this, Private Coleman. Go home, live your life. Honor your brothers who didn't make it, but forget what you saw in that jungle. For everyone's sake, including your own." I signed. What choice did I have? I was 19 years old, exhausted, half-starved, and scared. They had all the power, all the authority, and maybe, in some twisted way, they were right. Maybe the world wasn't ready. But I never forgot. I couldn't forget. How do you forget something like that? Outside the tent, I found the raider I'd spoken to in November. He'd just finished his session. He looked at me, and I nodded. We both knew what had just happened. We'd been silenced. Officially, legally, permanently. "At least we know we're not crazy," he said quietly. "Yeah," I agreed. "There's that." We left Guadalcanal 2 days later. 58 Marines had been called into that tent. 58 men who'd seen something impossible and been told to forget it. Most of us kept that promise. Some didn't. I heard stories over the years of Marines who'd talked and faced the consequences, lost their benefits, had their reputations destroyed. One supposedly ended up in a psychiatric facility. Whether he was actually crazy or whether that was just a convenient way to discredit him, I never knew. But most of us stayed silent, because that's what we'd been trained to do. Follow orders, keep secrets, protect our brothers. And in a strange way, keeping this secret felt like protecting those beings. If the world knew about them, what would happen? Hunters would come, scientists, curiosity seekers. The island would be overrun. Whatever peace they'd had for thousands of years would be destroyed. So we stayed quiet, and we carried the weight of that impossible truth alone. I went on to fight at Cape Gloucester and Peleliu, made it through the war, got my discharge in November of 1945 with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and memories I'd spend the rest of my life trying to process. Came home to Ohio in December. Snow was falling when I got off the train in Cleveland. My mother cried when she saw me. My father shook my hand and told me he was proud. My little sister, who'd been 12 when I left, was 15 and barely recognized me. I barely recognized myself. I tried to go back to normal life, tried to pretend I was the same kid who'd enlisted in December of 1941. But I wasn't. How could I be? I'd seen things, done things, killed men, watched friends die, and carried secrets that made all of that seem almost simple by comparison. The hardest part wasn't the combat memories. The Corps had prepared us for that in its way. There were other veterans to talk to, people who understood. But the giants? That secret? I had nobody. The 57 other men who'd signed those papers were scattered across the country, and we'd been explicitly forbidden from contacting each other. I was alone with knowledge that changed everything I thought I knew about the world, and I couldn't tell a single soul. I got a job at a Ford plant in Dearborn, assembly line work, repetitive, mind-numbing, perfect for a veteran who didn't want to think too much. Met a girl named Margaret at a church social in 1947. Red hair, green eyes, a laugh that could light up a room. She was a teacher, 2nd grade. She asked me about the war on our 3rd date. I don't really talk about it, I told her. That's okay, she said. A lot of veterans don't. But if you ever want to, I'm here to listen. I almost told her then, almost broke that promise I'd made. But I thought about the papers I'd signed, the threats they'd made, and I kept quiet. We got married in 1948, had our first kid, Michael, in 49. Sarah came in 51 and Robert in 54. I was a good father, or I tried to be, but there was always this distance, this barrier I couldn't cross. Margaret noticed. Of course she noticed. She was too smart not to. You're somewhere else sometimes, she told me one night in 1957. The kids were asleep. We were sitting in the living room, and she'd just asked me what I was thinking about. Your eyes go distant, and you're not here anymore. You're back there, aren't you, in the war? Yeah, I said, which was true, but it wasn't the battles I was thinking about. It was the jungle, the giants, the weight of knowing something the world didn't. Do you want to talk about it? I can't. Can't or won't. Both. She squeezed my hand. Okay, but I'm here when you're ready. I never was ready. How do you tell your wife that the world is stranger than she imagines, that there are beings out there that science says shouldn't exist, that her husband saw something that would make most people question his sanity? I couldn't risk it. Couldn't risk losing her, losing my family, losing everything because of something I'd seen for a few terrifying minutes on an island half a world away. The years passed. Michael grew up and went to Vietnam. That nearly killed me, sending my boy to war. He came back, thank God, but different. I recognized that look in his eyes, the distance, the weight. I wanted to tell him I understood, that I'd carried my own secrets home from my war. But I didn't. I stayed silent. Margaret got sick in 1985. Cancer. She fought for 2 years before it took her. In those final weeks when the morphine made her drowsy, but her mind was still clear, she asked me again. That secret you've been keeping all these years, she said, the one you think I don't know about. Will you ever tell me? How did you? Frank, I was married to you for 37 years. You think I didn't notice? The nightmares, the way you'd stare at old war documentaries about the Pacific, the time I caught you looking at maps of the Solomon Islands at 3 a.m. You've been carrying something heavy, I've always known. I held her hand. It was so thin by then, so fragile. I signed papers, I said, made promises. If I break them, you'd lose your pension, your benefits. I know. You've always been so responsible, so dutiful. But Frank, I'm dying, and I'd like to know what my husband has been carrying all these years, what's been keeping him up at night. You don't have to tell me the details, just give me something, please. So I told her, not everything, but enough, about the patrol, about seeing something that shouldn't exist, about the papers I'd signed and the silence I'd kept. She was quiet for a long time. Then she smiled. I knew it was something like that. You're not surprised? Surprised? Frank, you're the most honest, straightforward man I've ever known. The only reason you'd keep a secret for 40 years is if you were protecting something or someone. And now I know. Thank you for telling me. She died 3 days later. At her funeral, as they lowered her casket into the ground, I realized I was one of the last ones left. Most of the men from my platoon were gone. Morrison had died in 59, Hayes in 72, Rodriguez in 81. How many of the other 57 were still alive? 10? 5? Fewer? The secret was dying with us. In another 20 years, everyone who'd seen those beings would be dead, and the truth would die too. Buried in classified files nobody would ever read, remembered by nobody, denied by everyone. But here's what I've come to understand in the 82 years since Guadalcanal. They weren't hallucinations. We weren't suffering from combat stress or malaria-induced fever dreams. What we saw was real. I know it was real because I can still see them when I close my eyes. I can still remember the way they moved, the sound they made, the look in those alien eyes. After 82 years, most memories fade. These haven't. They're as clear now as they were in 1942. And I know it was real because of what I found 30 years ago. It was 1994. I was 71 years old in San Diego for routine tests at a VA hospital, just checking on an old shrapnel wound that liked to act up in winter. Nothing serious. While I was waiting, and anyone who's been to a VA hospital knows you do a lot of waiting, I struck up a conversation with another veteran in the waiting room. He was younger than me, late 40s, maybe early 50s, Vietnam era from the way he carried himself and the tattoo on his forearm. 3rd Marine Division. We talked about the usual things veterans talk about, where we served, who we knew, the way the Corps had changed over the decades. Then he mentioned he'd done some time in intelligence after coming back from Vietnam, working on historical records, filing and archiving old reports, classification reviews, the kind of desk work they give to guys who've seen too much combat and need something quieter. "You were at Guadalcanal?" he asked when I mentioned I'd been with the Devil Dogs. "First wave," I confirmed. "Landed on Red Beach in August of 42. He got quiet then, glanced around the waiting room like he was checking to see who might be listening. Then he leaned in closer. "You ever hear the stories?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "About the giants?" My heart stopped, actually stopped for a second. After 30 years of perfect silence, of carrying this alone, someone was asking me about it. Someone who knew. "What?" I managed to say. He pulled out a notebook from his jacket. Old, worn leather, the kind you write in, not type. He flipped through pages covered in small, neat handwriting until he found what he was looking for. "Old reports," he said quietly. "Buried deep in the archives, deeper than deep. Classification level I'd never even heard of before. There were dozens of witness statements, all from Marines on Guadalcanal between August 1942 and February 43. All reporting the same thing. Massive humanoid figures in the jungle. 10 to 12 feet tall. Not Japanese, not indigenous islanders. Something else." He turned the notebook so I could see. Names, dates, unit designations. A list that went on for 3 pages. I recognized some of the names. Morrison, Hayes, Rodriguez, men from my platoon. But there were dozens more, Marines I'd never met who'd seen the same things we had. "All of the reports were classified," he continued, "stamped "Do Not Discuss." Most were marked "Archive and Forget." But there was more than just witness statements. There were photographs. "Photographs?" My voice came out hoarse. 15 of them, taken from distance with telephoto lenses, blurry some of them, but clear enough to see they weren't faked, clear enough to show size comparison with known objects, trees, vehicles, Marines. And they weren't photos of humans in costumes or trick photography. They were real. He flipped to another page. A sketch. He'd drawn it from memory, but it was accurate enough to make my breath catch. The proportions, the posture, the way the arms hung too long. "There were also anthropological reports," he said. "Scientists brought in to study footprints, to analyze what little physical evidence could be collected. hair samples, material from what might have been shelters or nests deep in the jungle interior. One report even mentioned scat analysis, though the results were inconclusive. What did the scientists say? They didn't know what to make of it. Best guess was some kind of Gigantopithecus, though that species supposedly went extinct 300,000 years ago. Or maybe Homo floresiensis scaled up somehow, though that didn't make evolutionary sense. One anthropologist suggested it might be an entirely unknown branch of the hominin tree, something that diverged before Homo sapiens but survived in isolated pockets. He showed me another page, photographs of footprints, castings that had been made, measurements. The same prints I'd seen that night in August of '42, the same impossible size. There was even speculation, he continued, that these beings might have been on the island for thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands. Melanesian myths mention tall ones who lived in the deep jungle. The Germans who colonized the Solomons in the early 1900s reported seeing them. Even the Japanese mentioned them in some of their reports, though they mostly dismissed them as superstition or Allied propaganda. So they knew, I said. They always knew. They knew. They documented everything, studied it, tried to understand it, and then they buried it all. Classification so deep that even people with top-secret clearance couldn't access it. I only saw the files because of a clerical error. Someone misfiled a box, and I opened it thinking it was Vietnam War documents, found a whole archive of Guadalcanal reports that were never supposed to see daylight. Why are you telling me this? He looked at me for a long moment. Because I see it in your eyes. That look. The old Guadalcanal vets all have it. That 1,000-yard stare that's different from normal combat trauma. You saw them, didn't you? I couldn't answer. The papers I'd signed, the threats. Even 30 years later, even though everyone who'd made those threats was probably dead, the fear was still there. It's okay, he said quietly. You don't have to say anything, but I thought you should know. You're not crazy. What you saw was real. It was documented, photographed, studied. The only reason the world doesn't know is because someone decided the truth was too dangerous to share. What happened to the files? Reclassified, moved to even deeper storage. I don't know where. Somewhere nobody will ever find them without the right clearances and the right reason to look. They'll probably sit there until they rot, or until someone decides to shred them. Either way, the truth stays buried. He tore out a page from his notebook and handed it to me. The list of names, the witnesses. I thought you might want this, in case you ever wanted to reach out. Find the others who saw what you saw. Most of them are probably dead by now. But maybe some are still out there, still carrying the same weight you are. I took the page with shaking hands. Why risk this, showing me these things? If they found out, I'm dying, he said simply. Cancer. 6 months, maybe a year if I'm lucky. What are they going to do to me? Take away my death benefits? I don't have kids, don't have anyone waiting for me. But you're carrying something that's eaten at you for decades. I can see it. And I thought maybe knowing the truth, knowing you weren't crazy, might help. Thank you, I said, and I meant it, more than he could possibly know. One more thing, he said, as they called my name for my appointment. In one of the reports, there was a note from a scientist. He'd spent 3 weeks on Guadalcanal in late '42, trying to track these beings, trying to make contact. He never found them, but he left a comment in his final report that stuck with me. What did he say? He said, if these beings have survived for thousands of years while remaining hidden from modern humans, they possess an intelligence and understanding of their environment that far exceeds our own. We should not be studying them. They should be studying us, and perhaps they are. That conversation changed everything for me. For 30 years, I'd wondered if maybe, just maybe, it had been a hallucination. Combat stress, malaria, some trick of the light and exhaustion and fear. But now I knew. It was real, all of it, And they documented it, studied it, photographed it, then buried it all because the truth didn't fit their narrative. I kept that page from his notebook. Still have it, actually, though most of the names are faded now and some I can't read anymore. Over the years, I tried to track down some of the other witnesses. Most were dead. A few I found addresses for, but I never had the courage to reach out. What would I say? Hey, remember that impossible thing we saw 80 years ago that we swore we'd never talk about? Want to break our oath and reminisce? But knowing they were out there, knowing I wasn't alone, that made the weight easier to carry. Even if we never spoke about it, we shared something. An experience that changed how we saw the world. A truth that the world wasn't ready to hear. I'm 102 years old now. I'm the last surviving member of my platoon. Every other man who was there that night is dead. The officers who threatened us are dead. The intelligence agents who made us sign those papers are dead. The bureaucrats who ordered the cover-up are dead. And I'm here, still alive somehow, still carrying this story that I was never supposed to tell. So I'm telling it now. I don't care about the papers I signed 82 years ago. I don't care about the threats. I don't care if people think I'm a senile old man spinning tall tales. I was there. I saw them. And the world deserves to know that on that island in the Pacific, while young men were killing each other over a strip of dirt and an airfield, there were witnesses, ancient, intelligent, watching witnesses that predated our conflicts, predated our nations, predated everything we thought we knew about human history. The giants of Guadalcanal were real. And somewhere, buried in a classified archive that nobody admits exists, there's proof. Photographs, reports, scientific analyses, all locked away because acknowledging them would mean admitting that we don't know everything. That there are things in this world that don't fit our carefully constructed narratives. I've carried this secret for 82 years. Now it's yours. Do with it what you will, believe me or don't. But know that on Guadalcanal, in 1942, a young Marine named Frank Coleman saw something that changed everything he thought he understood about the world. And he's not crazy. He never was. They were real. They are real. And they're still out there, somewhere in those Solomon jungles, watching, waiting, bearing witness to what we do to each other and wondering, perhaps, why we seem so intent on destroying ourselves when there's so much more to the world than we ever imagined. Sometimes I think about that moment in the clearing, when the smaller one stood there watching our battered platoon carry our wounded. I think about the expression in its eyes, and I wonder if it understood what we were fighting for, if it understood nations and politics and the reasons humans go to war, or if, to a being that might have watched humans for thousands of years, we just looked like children fighting over toys, too young to understand that there are bigger mysteries in the world than who controls a strip of beach or an airfield. I hope they're still out there. I hope they survived the battles, the bombs, the defoliation that came later. I hope they're deep in some jungle that humans haven't reached yet, living their lives in peace, watching and remembering. Because someone should remember. Someone should bear witness to what we've done, what we've seen, what we've lost. And if it can't be us, if we're too caught up in our wars and our classifications and our need to control the narrative, then maybe it should be them. The giants, the watchers, the ancient ones who were here long before we arrived and who might, if we're lucky, be here long after we're gone. That's my story. That's the truth I've kept for 82 years. And now, finally, I can rest knowing that someone knows, someone heard, someone listened to an old Marine talk about the impossible thing he saw on a jungle island in the middle of a war that killed millions. We were not alone on Guadalcanal. We were being watched, and somewhere, in some classified file that nobody will ever admit exists, There's proof that the world is stranger, more wonderful, and more terrifying than any of us imagined. Have you ever witnessed something you simply couldn't explain? Something that changed your understanding of reality itself? If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. We share stories like this every single day. And if you know a veteran who deserves to have their story told, share this with them. These stories deserve to be remembered.